Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Sanmay, for agreeing to give a talk. Guys, we are very fortunate to have Professor Sanmay Das from George Mason University with us. Sanmay has many research interests. Among his research interests, he's primarily interested in designing effective algorithms for agents in complex, uncertain environments, and in understanding the social or collective outcomes of individual behavior. Dr. Das is the chair of the ACM Special Interest Group on Artificial Intelligence, a member of the board of directors of the International Foundation for Autonomous Agents and Multi-Agent Systems, and serves as an associate editor of the ACM Transactions on Economics and Computation and of the Journal of Artificial Intelligence Research. Dr. Das has served as program co-chair of the AMAS and AMMA conferences, in addition to regularly serving as an area chair or senior program committee member of major conferences, including ICHCAI, AAAI, EC, and AMAS. He has been recognized with several awards for research and teaching, including an NSF Career Award and the Department Chair Award for Outstanding Teaching at Washington University. Uh, with that, thank you so much, Sanvi, for being here, and please feel free to get started.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to attempt to share my screen and hope that that works. Okay, so let me jump in. I'm going to give you a little bit of context and then start talking. And as I said to Amulya, I believe you guys will perhaps ask questions over the chat or something, but I'm happy to be interrupted as much as possible. So I'm going to be talking about algorithmic allocation of scarce societal resources and how do we do that kind of the right way. This is work that we've been doing over several years, so there's a long list of co-authors over here, but I'll just point out that Amanda, Kwan, and Andrew are all current PhD students at WashU. Patrick is a professor at the Brown School, and Roman and Eugene are both professors in computer science and engineering, all at WashU. I just moved from WashU to George Mason 3 months ago, something like that. So this is sort of a long sort of stream of research that I'm excited to tell everyone more about as we go. So let me just put it in a slightly broader context in terms of my research interests, right? So one of the things that I've been particularly interested in thinking about over the last few years has been this notion that we now live in an algorithmically mediated society. And let me talk about a couple of versions of that that are not what I will primarily focus on today, but that I also find sort of super interesting in general, and will lay the context for how much I think AI is influencing everyone's lives in kind of a constant way. So more and more we see that interactions, both sort of the kinds of interactions that we have with computers, but also interactions that we have with other human beings, are increasingly mediated by algorithms. And this ranges from things like Facebook's news feed kind of determining, what is the kind of news that you see, to Wikipedia being a primary source of information that people get on many topics, to the fact that there are things like YouTube's up next recommendation algorithms. And all of these algorithmic innovations have kind of shaped how we perceive what's going on in society, and how we acquire information, how we distribute information, and so on. And I think that that really changes sort of the general ecosystem of social interaction in a very significant way. And I think we need to understand, in order to understand the system, it's really important to understand, who are the players who are designing these algorithms, what are their incentives, and how does all of that come together, right? So just a famous example of that is this whole thing that has built up over the last 15 years almost about how YouTube's up next algorithm has been implicated in increasing polarization, because, and again, it's not entirely clear what was the driving factor behind this, but it is clear that their recommendation algorithm will steer you towards more and more sort of extreme content very quickly. It's thought that that's just something that has been learned over time as a way of maximizing engagement. So you're trying to learn, a policy that maximizes engagement, that might be what you end up with. But of course, what are the downstream effects on that on society is not something that you can, go out there and investigate back in 2006, 2007 without knowing a lot more about the path that kind of thing is going to follow. More directly, and this is kind of what I'm going to be talking about a lot more today, there's actual situations where algorithms are in the loop of societal decision making, and this involves many different domains. It could be who gets a loan or doesn't get a loan, which families are investigated for child maltreatment once a social services agency receives a possible report that there is a child who may be suffering from neglect or maltreatment. Which people who are under arrest receive parole. Sort of all of these have gotten a lot of attention in recent years, and those are all situations where there's actually an algorithm that's in the loop that is kind of participating in the decision making as we go along. The other sort of counterpoint to this that I think is interesting for us as computer scientists and as information scientists is that because of this, we also have increasing amounts of data available to us that enable us to sort of study human behavior at kind of a granular scale that we haven't been able to before. And this includes, in things like Wikipedia and Facebook, obviously the actual digital traces of what are people doing online, what are their interactions like. But in the kinds of domains that I'm going to talk about, this also means that we have pretty large scale observational and administrative data sets that are kind of tracking, people's interactions with various service agencies. Did they receive services? For how long did they receive services? And what data did we have about them when they came in and they received these services? So there's equally sort of an opportunity, which presents its own challenges, but an opportunity to use that data to gain insights into human behavior that we may not be able to do as easily otherwise. A lot of this area has gotten a lot of negative pushback, right? So these are just, two books that I think have made a pretty big splash in the media in the last few years, including Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil and Automating Inequality by Virginia Eubanks, that look at kind of situations where algorithmic decision making can go awry and create all kinds of possible problems. At the same time, AI has also been used in a lot of areas to actually build systems that I think are actually delivering better outcomes for those who are participating than they would earlier. I kind of include broadly a bunch of sort of what I think of as economic engineering in this general area, because a lot of the insights and the ideas are roughly similar, right? So I study matching and assignment problems a lot, and all of these can be thought of within that general framework, ranging from something that's been around for decades, which is the match between medical students in their first residencies that Al Roth famously kind of worked with a bunch of stakeholders to extend to being able to do a better job of matching couples who want to be in the same place to their first residency program after they finish med school. These days, AI is being used to do a better job of matching refugees to particular cities that have spaces for them to try to maximize the probability that they're able to adapt to life well over there. There are all kinds of other areas as well, including school choice. How do you design the allocation of students to different public schools in large school systems? And sort of something that I think about a lot is the use of AI in organ donation. In particular, there's been a lot of work in this in the living donor kidney exchange kind of setting, where somebody can actually donate one of their two kidneys to somebody who needs a kidney. So there's been a lot of sort of interesting work that I think has actually gone out there and been deployed in the world that has been quite helpful in various of these systems. So my current research agenda focuses in sort of two major areas, and the first of these is what I'm going to be largely talking about to all of you today, which is the allocation of scarce societal resources. So I'm about to dive into that further, but the other side of my research is that I'm also very interested in using machine learning to try and solve measurement problems in the social sciences. And if anyone's interested in talking about that later, I'd be happy to talk about that as well. where the basic idea is that, machine learning has become very, very good at solving a particular set of problems. And those are typically prediction problems, right? At the same time, in the social sciences, most of the time people are not interested in prediction for prediction's sake. They're interested in thinking about, what are the driving factors, what has causal impacts, and so on and so forth. One thing I've become interested in is thinking about when can we actually use machine learning to measure quantities that are actually of interest to social scientists, so that the things that we're good at, which is out of sample prediction, can actually be directly leveraged. And two particular examples that I've been thinking about a lot are predicting default in order to measure credit risk, and therefore to try to build up sort of measures of systemic risk, perhaps. And in thinking about how we can use text to measure political ideology. And so can we use predictions of partisanship to think about, what does this say about the political ideology of the person who's using it, or the strategic use of language. And in particular, I'm interested in both sort of areas where this can succeed and areas where naive use of machine learning ideas can fail. But with that as kind of background, so that you get a sense of kind of, where I'm coming from and where these interests come from, I want to kind of dive into what I want to focus on today. So today I'm going to be thinking specifically about sort of a narrow range of problems. So I'm going to be thinking about the allocation of scarce societal resources. And this is typically going to be allocation that is being done at a local level. And so, so when we think about this, sort of, let me start with the examples that I've got over there, right? I'll be focusing a lot today on shelter beds and services for homeless households. Other examples include organs for transplantation or spaces in public schools. So what are the unifying features of these kinds of application domains, right? So first of all, in most sort of modern Western democratic societies, right, we generally think of these as things that should be provisioned for by the state. That is that, we should not be in a situation where we offer no services for the homeless. We should not be in a situation where organs can be bought or sold. We believe that public education should exist, and therefore there should be a way of deciding, who gets spots in which kinds of schools. And so these are all situations where there has to be some kind of a local agency that comes up with a sort of local decision-making mechanism that decides, how do we actually do this allocation, keeping in mind whatever goals we have societally for this purpose. Okay, so these are typically areas where we can't rely on market mechanisms to solve the balance of supply and demand. We need sort of some kind of regulation, some kind of policies in place for who gets these resources, when, why, and so on. So if we want to bring algorithms into this picture, right, we have to think about, and I think that it can be useful. So just to be clear, right, I'm not necessarily talking about just having an algorithm that's going to go in there and take over from human decision making, but I'm a strong believer that considering algorithmic allocation can help to shine a light on the system in a sort of formal and quantitative manner that can help human decision making if we decide that we want to stick to human decision making. It can provide perhaps decision aids for humans if that's what we decide. And in some situations, maybe it even makes sense to switch over to largely algorithmic decision making. But I'm not necessarily contending that we have to go out there and switch to full-on algorithmic decision making in all of these domains. But I think it's always a good exercise to try to come up with, if we were going to do this algorithmically, how would we want to do it, and then use that as the lens that we're shining on the system. So if we want to do that, we've got to at least be able to predict outcomes, right? That is to say, what would be the value of matching person A with resource alpha? If I take this household and I put them in an emergency shelter versus putting them into a more heavyweight intervention like transitional housing, what are the relative benefits of doing that? We have to be able to consider individual preferences in our decision making, as well as the incentives that are created by our decision-making mechanism. That is, are we perhaps incentivizing people to lie about, themselves in order to get these resources? Are we being incentive compatible in the mechanisms that we're designing? And finally, and perhaps sort of, most contentiously, we need to think about what our objectives are. And this can range, right? We may be wanting to think about the efficiency of outcomes. We may be thinking in terms of equity. I like to think about a lot of this in terms of the political philosophy of justice, right? Which is what are the distributional consequences of these kinds of decision-making strategies? And that has overlaps with, but I think sometimes differences from the algorithmic fairness literature as well. Today, the driving application that I'm going to be talking about is homelessness services, and I think that it will serve as kind of a useful sort of domain to understand a little bit more about in order to move forward. Of course, Amulya himself has done kind of a lot of cool work in this area as well, and so many of you may have heard about a fair amount of these kinds of things. But I'm just going to sort of give you a brief overview from my perspective of the system that we are going to analyze and try to use that to talk about the problems that it raises for some of the algorithmic decision making. Okay, the one sort of, if you remember sort of one slide from this, this is the motivating slide for some of the different things that we're going to think about, right? So what I've got over here is I've got a picture that's asking, when can we improve social welfare is the question. And what I've got over here is, let's say I've got people or households in green and resources in yellow. And I've got a graph over here, and this is labeled with edge weights, where the edge weight represents to some extent what is the value of matching this agent with this resource, right? So in this case, what I have is I have that resources are homogeneous. So what that means is whoever gets the top resource over here will get a value of 3 from getting that resource. Whoever gets the bottom resource will get a value of 8 from getting that resource. So in this kind of a situation, there's not much I can do in terms of efficiency, right? Whichever matching I make, whether I match, again, I'm thinking about sort of matching one agent to one resource in this kind of a situation. One of the agents is going to get 3, one of the agents is going to get 8, right? There's no sort of gains from trade that can happen over here. So in this case, really sort of equity and fairness and justice are kind of the questions that we need to think about. On the other hand, there may be situations in which actually there is significant heterogeneity in the quality of these matches. So in this case, we have kind of the opposite situation, which is if the top agent gets matched with the top resource and the bottom agent gets matched with the bottom resource, they both get values of 3 for those matches. But if we do the diagonal match, then they both get values of 8, right? So over here, there's a real benefit to changing the match and going with the diagonal match, because everybody is better off in that kind of a situation. Now, what will that mean for us? We're not going to see things being sort of this clear in most of the actual sort of applications that we work on, but I want you to be able to think of these as kind of, the two edges of what we can have. And I want to think about sort of, can we achieve better outcomes, and and what does that mean both in terms of efficiency? So for example, how can we make sure that we achieve closer to the diagonal match in these heterogeneous settings? And how do we think about fairness overall? That is, who should get the more intensive resource in this kind of a case, right? So this is kind of the fundamental set of questions that we need to think about. Okay, so homelessness, just to give you an idea of the scale of the problem that we're talking about, right? It's a huge and costly public health threat. There's been barely any decrease in measurements of homelessness since the Department of Housing and Urban Development began tracking this in 2007, right? We are not in a good shape in the US. For example, in one night in January of 2018, right, when it's cold and homelessness can be a much more severe problem, there were more than 110,000 American children living in homeless households. So, obviously the number of actual homeless then goes up even higher, but we're actually just talking about children over there in the wealthiest country in the world in some ways. So, so this is obviously like a massive problem that we have to deal with. There's lots of evidence on just, exposure to homelessness is associated with really bad sort of outcomes over time for these people, particularly for those children who are less than 18. They are more likely to be reported to child welfare. They're more likely to then be placed into foster care. That leads to them being more likely to themselves be homeless when they're youth. And then this just has, a vicious cycle of problems that start occurring in those cases. Um, even if you're not thinking about these very costly sort of long-term ramifications for the people involved, there's there's also just a significant cost to society in terms of the money that we are spending on services associated with these. In fact, estimates are that we will end up, socially paying more than $4,000 per month per homeless individual, and that is sort of costs that are spread across various different social service systems and justice systems. So this includes people who are homeless are much more likely to end up in the hospital. So you've got healthcare costs that are coming in from there. You've got the costs of the criminal justice system. You've got the costs of the actual homeless services system. So even if you're not thinking in terms of just the quality of life and how much loss there is on that front, there's a lot of sort of direct monetary cost um, to the state for the problem of homelessness that goes beyond just the amount that we're spending on the homeless system, but has ramifications across all kinds of agencies. Um, and finally, as I'm sort of reiterating this point, but homelessness is just a base problem, right? Once you're homeless, it becomes very hard to effectively deliver other services, including mental health, substance abuse, services for children, and so on and so forth. So it's really sort of perhaps even much more, maybe an order of magnitude more costly than it even appears to be. Now, within that, right, how do we actually go around delivering services? So first of all, the homeless system in the US is largely funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The important thing to remember from this is that it's kind of federally funded and mandated, but it's run through a network of local agencies. In 2014, there were about 24,000 of these agencies across 416 different communities. Each of them has a lot of discretion in service delivery. They're required to do certain things like run emergency shelters, provide access to different kinds of housing support, but there's a lot of local flexibility in how they discover this. So it's really kind of a patchwork of provision of these kinds of services. So when people have looked at this from kind of an analytics perspective, the conventional approach to it has been something like this, right? You do what's called a predictive risk assessment, which is to assign risk scores or vulnerability scores to agents. And then you can use that to either prioritize different service levels. So for example, give the most intensive services to those who are rated as sort of the most risky or the most vulnerable, and then keep moving down as you have available services. Or you can use these risk assessment scores to triage for services. So in child welfare, for example, you can use a risk score to decide whether upon receiving a report of maltreatment, do you actually send a caseworker out to investigate that further? Do you screen it in or do you not screen it in? Instead of this, the first thing that I want to talk about today is are we missing out on potential benefits that could leverage these differences in match quality that you saw on the heterogeneous side of that graph that I presented? So the idea would be that there's heterogeneous treatment effects. There are some households that are for whom some services are better targeted. What can we do in terms of just increasing a standard additive notion of social welfare by leveraging that idea? Then I'm going to turn to talking about fairness and justice, like how do we conceptualize and quantify some notion of fairness in allocation over here. And I'll turn to kind of a stylized, simpler version of the problem and talk through sort of some ideas from both theory and practice about how to conceptualize that. I have one slide on an interesting ongoing project on incentivizing truthful reporting in these systems as well. I'm not 100% sure if I'll get to that, but happy to talk about it if people are interested. Okay, so a couple of things to keep in mind. One of these is that what's going on when we're talking about local allocation of scarce societal resources is explicitly local. That is, there's an agency that has some kind of a budget and is supposed to serve a certain population. and that's their job. So you can think about it as sort of, this is a small universe, and we need to just think about that locally small universe. We're explicitly not talking about things that are things like, how should we optimally set tax policy at the federal level to deliver, the kind of just society that we want. We're talking about much more local problems of allocation here. So let me sort of dive in to the data that we have in the model that we're going to use. So we have a bunch of data that relates to a homeless agency that was providing services in the following manner. People would call a hotline. If the hotline is able to allocate you, then you get allocated to one of 4 different possible services. So these services, in kind of order of intensity, are transitional housing, rapid rehousing, emergency shelter, or homelessness prevention, right? So you can basically think of this as, 4 different possible interventions of decreasing commitment in terms of how much you have to spend and how much effort you have to put into that. A couple of sort of notes on that. We're not going to be looking at, so we're only going to be looking at the data on those who actually receive an intervention. There's, of course, an equally important question about those who do not receive an intervention, right? Who should receive the interventions? How are we making those kinds of decisions? And that's something that, like, our data set doesn't really allow us to explore in as much detail as the question of just what can we think about among the population who did receive interventions. So I'm not going to think about that right now. And I'm also not looking at a small set of those who are allocated to a different intervention called permanent supportive housing, which is much smaller in scope than these 4. And is an important intervention, but that has, we're going to be talking about a data set of about 14,000 people. There were only about 250 that were put into permanent supportive housing. And that's really, as the name suggests, supposed to be somewhat different. It's more permanent, whereas these are supposed to be transitional. And that leads us to our goal, which is that what we want is, after somebody receives services, what we're hoping is that they make a successful exit from homelessness. Of course, we can't necessarily measure that exactly, but the way that we're going to measure that is we're going to measure that by saying that they don't interact again with the agency within 2 years after their first exit from the system. So what do we want to do in this case? Well, we can set this up as a mixed integer linear program that says, all right, if I want to optimize, I can try to minimize this product of Pij's, Xij's, where Xij is an indicator variable telling me whether or not household I is placed in intervention J. So I've got 4 types of interventions, and I've got all of my households, which are indexed by I, and Xij is going to tell me which of these interventions did I place this household into. The Pij's are the probability of household I re-entering if they are placed in intervention J. And in this case, what my constraints tell me are, okay, I need each household to be placed into exactly one of the interventions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to respect the capacities of the interventions by saying, hey, each intervention has a particular capacity at any particular point in time. So we're actually going to, you can do this in different settings. What we're going to do is we're going to batch everyone who arrives in the course of a week, figure out capacities by figuring out how many people actually were put into that intervention in that week, and just set that up as the capacity of that intervention for that week. All right. So basically what we're asking is, can we do a better job of minimizing the number of reentries by shuffling on a weekly basis who gets which intervention? So the key question that kind of remains over here is, where do these Pij values come from, right? How do I estimate what is the probability that household I will re-enter within the next 2 years if that household is placed into intervention J? So let me tell you a little bit about what our data looks like so that you can come to an understanding of what we did on that front, right? We have data on, as I said, about 14,000 households that entered the system over an 8-year period. And we actually have a lot of data on the households that did enter. It includes things like, gender, is their spouse present? Are they chronically homeless? Are they a veteran? Do they have a disabling condition? Do they have a substance abuse problem? Are they HIV positive? All other kinds of things. And then we also have some derived features, like we can figure out their age, we can figure out sort of their monthly income. We also know how many times they've called the hotline before they get placed into services, and how long they've been waiting between the first time that they called and when they actually got placed into services. So this gives us a total of 68 different features that we can use. And if we look at the entire data set, we are defining reentry as either calling the hotline again, which is really a measure of need, and is one of the cool things that we have in this data set, because we're not necessarily measuring reentry as both you needing reentry and the system having the capacity to allow you reentry. We're just asking, did you end up calling the hotline again? In which case that seems to show that you're in need of services, even if it turns out that there didn't happen to be services you could receive at that time. And you can see that there's kind of, about 29% do re-enter, but there's significant difference among the different interventions. Transitional housing has about 34% re-entering. Homelessness prevention has only 14% re-entering, but you have to keep in mind that that's actually a very different population that's receiving homelessness prevention, because in order to receive homelessness prevention in general, you're typically a much less vulnerable type of household than the types who are going to emergency shelters. So that number by itself is highly sort of skewed by sample selection bias there.
Sanmay, one question.
Yep.
What exactly is, or what does homelessness prevention entail?
So homelessness prevention, right, great question. So I should have gone into this a bit more. So the definition of homelessness is a little bit like weird, right? So homelessness prevention typically means that you are at imminent risk of losing housing. And homelessness prevention will usually give you subsidies to try to maintain that kind of, to either maintain or find some kind of appropriate housing for yourself. It can also give you a network of referrals that would allow you to do things like, for example, a lot of people end up becoming homeless, especially in cold places, not necessarily because they don't have a place to go, but because they can't keep their place heated. And so what they can do is they can provide you with a referral to get your heat restarted, or a month of your heating bill paid off, or something like that. Or they can give you subsidies to spend on those kinds of things. Which does sort of raise a question that we've been investigating a lot, right? Which is just that there's a population of people, the definition of homelessness is kind of fuzzy, and there's a population of people who are prevention eligible, and there's a population of people who may not be prevention eligible. And so you need to think a little bit carefully about, would it make sense to give these people homelessness prevention at all? Because you can't give homelessness prevention to somebody who actually completely doesn't physically have any kind of a place to stay, whereas you can in sort of many other kinds of situations. And so in some of our other work, we're looking more extensively into that. But
So
yeah.
just to make sure that I understand, these are people who still have homes. They're still living in homes, but they're at risk of losing their homes.
So it's a little bit fuzzier than that, right? It's technically supposed to be that. It's supposed to be that you're at imminent risk of becoming homeless, but it could be that you've actually, that you would qualify as homeless under other definitions, because you've most recently been couch surfing or living with families or something else, because your place has not been habitable. So you don't have kind of a habitable place. And so, it's, but yes, in general, it would imply that there exists some kind of a shelter where theoretically you could pump some money into it and make that a habitable place.
Makes sense. Okay.
Okay, so the first thing that we actually did was we tried to figure out, okay, if we try to just predict who's going to re-enter and who's not going to re-enter, let's try a slew of different sort of machine learning models to see which of these can give us good out of sample prediction accuracy for who re-enters the system and who doesn't. And one thing that you'll find interesting, so we had a hope, in fact, even if this hadn't turned out as nicely as it did turn out, we would have gone with what we did. But you've probably all seen sort of, the four methods that we've got over here, which is logistic regression, lasso, which is L1 regularized regression, random forests, and gradient boosted trees. And we can see that they all do pretty well in terms of AUC. Many of these are pretty similar to each other, actually. But BART is Bayesian additive regression trees, which is a model that has that was proposed about 10 years or so ago. That's an ensemble model. But in addition to actually being a good sort of predictor, the other cool thing about it is that it allows us to estimate counterfactual probabilities. And it's actually been used in this setting. And that is what we are going to need, because actually we're also going to need to be able to sort of predict these probabilities for a household getting an intervention that it did not actually get in order to solve our optimization problem. And that's kind of one of the big pluses of BART, is that, you know, people are relatively confident that building a causal model from observational data is something that it does, you know, as well as anything else that works with observational data. So it's competitive with sort of matching techniques and other kinds of techniques for doing this kind of prediction. And as you can see, it also actually does well along all of the standard metrics that we'd like AUC. Its calibration level is very good. And in fact, it's well calibrated across each of the different interventions as well. So we're going to use BART basically to go about sort of coming up with these Pij values that I've noted over here, right? So so that's what's going to give us the Pijs, and then that gives us a mixed integer linear program that we can go about solving. So the first question that comes up is, you know, do we actually see these heterogeneous treatment effects? Are we actually going to be able to sort of, you know, get a benefit from doing this reoptimization? So here's something that's kind of interesting, right? We actually see that if you look at, if you run this on all of the households, and then you just order the interventions by which intervention would be most effective for this household, you can see that there's some very sharp clusters, right? There's a bunch of households for which the ordering is prevention is the best, then rapid rehousing, then emergency shelter, then transitional housing. And then there's a bunch for whom transitional housing is clearly thought to be the best thing that can be provided, right? There's like 4,000 of those, 5,300 of these. There's another 1,700 of these, and then a smattering in the other kinds of places. So we can see that, you know, some of these orderings are definitely more common than the others. So it's obviously it's somewhere between that homogeneous and heterogeneous matching kind of situation, and that gives us some hope that we might be actually able to achieve some improvements in efficiency overall.
So Sanmay, one
Yep.
question. In
Yep.
the previous slide that you had, this, just to make sure that I understand, this ordering represents when you run your BART, PI prevention was highest for this household, followed by emergency.
Lowest, but yes, exactly. So
And
so prevention would be best, so reentry probability would be lowest, then emergency shelter, then rapid rehousing, then transitional housing for 856 households. And then for 5,300 of the households, prevention is the best, that is the lowest Pij, rapid rehousing has the second lowest, emergency shelter has the third lowest, transitional housing has the fourth lowest.
and these are all the number of households. There were no other orderings.
There were, I believe this is all of the orderings that we actually saw. Yep. So.
Okay.
So now if we take that in and we feed that in and we do this reoptimization on a weekly basis, right, what we do is we run on a subset that is 10,000 of these households that is basically because of the timing of the introduction of rapid rehousing into the system, which was because of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act during the last financial crisis. So on those households, in actual fact, we saw 2,765 reentries, that is 27.5% of them re-entered. BART predicts 2,725 of them would have re-entered out of samples. So we can kind of see that it's unbiased, right? If you do an out of sample prediction, that's pretty close to what we get. But if we do the optimal weekly reallocation, we bring that down to 2,155 reentries, right? So there's almost 600 in expectation. There's about 600 households that this new allocation system would have helped in terms of being able to keep them out of the homeless system for 2 years after exit, which is sort of an indication of a successful exit from homelessness, which is sort of a 22% improvement over what we initially had. So it's actually very promising in that sense. We're able to achieve potentially fairly substantial gains from doing this. And just to give a sort of baseline on what is the best we could possibly do, right? If there were no capacity constraints at all, and if every household were just placed in the best intervention for that household, we would still expect to have about 18% predicted reentry. So that kind of gives us a bound on what we could do. And we can see that we're moving a pretty large portion of the way towards that bound, getting down from 27.5 to 21.5%. What's the mechanism by which this is happening? It's actually a shuffling, and largely a lot of that shuffling is happening between people being moved from prevention to emergency shelters, from shelters to transitional housing, and then from transitional housing to prevention, right? So this is just the net flow of reallocations, people who had originally received transitional housing, now receiving homelessness prevention. And the basic suggestion over here is that there's a lot of people who are being put into transitional housing, which is, remember, a very heavyweight intervention, who may actually be able to do better with a lighter weight intervention where you're giving them sort of some resources and some flexibility to figure out how to deal with these problems themselves, which is kind of in keeping with the emerging literature on the success of prevention programs. That is that sometimes, like, you know, there are households that are better served by giving them some subsidies and the ability to make their own decisions up to a point, rather than being put into kind of a highly monitored kind of fishbowl environment that that involves a lot of sort of high contact services. Now, if you actually look at this, right, we see that this doesn't exactly come for free. It's not Pareto improving. We help about 40% of households. About 30% of them stay in the same intervention they were in, and about 30% of households are actually now expected to do worse than they were doing in the original intervention. But if you actually look at who is helped, it tends to be households with lower monthly incomes, longer waits before receiving services, and more calls to the hotline, which are all kind of measures of need or vulnerability. And so in some senses, this is promising, right? It's basically telling us, hey, we are able to do something to try and help what appear, at least from this kind of analysis, to be the more vulnerable households overall. So, so that kind of brings me to the next sort of chunk of stuff over here, because what I want to do is I want to turn, you know, this kind of leads us to thinking a little more quantitatively about how should we think about justice or fairness in these kinds of settings. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move to thinking about this a little bit more stylized setting. So so we're just going to think about, okay, if we had a set of people arriving and we had a set of utilities, what would be the best way to do this? And this builds a little bit on the literature on, you know, fair division and how do we actually do fair resource allocation of indivisible resources. So the model that we've been using so far of additive social welfare is a classic utilitarian model, right? Which basically means that an extra unit of utility for a starving household is treated exactly the same as the extra unit of utility for a wealthy one. The other sort of classic extreme is to think about Rawlsian utility functions, right? Which are usually realized as max min, that says, okay, what I want to do is I want to make the worst off member of society the best off. And in this case, we're constraining that to like the local problem that we're trying to solve. A natural refinement of the Rawlsian idea is what's called leximin, right? Which basically just does a recursive version of this. It says, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to maximize the utility of the worst off person. Conditioned on that, I'm going to maximize the utility of the second worst, and so on and so forth. So I just recursively iterate that all the way to the top. And there's been work on sort of all of this. And what we're interested in doing over here in this part is kind of analyzing what's called the price of fairness, right? Which is just what is the cost inefficiency that I suffer from taking this fairness perspective on the allocation that I'm supposed to make. All right. So if I just look at leximin, right, there's sort of, I just want to, I'm going to give you a flavor of these kinds of results. But this is sort of one of the classic examples of where price of fairness can look very, very bad for Leximin. So suppose you have n agents over here are the rows, and we've got n resources over here are the columns. And this is a cost matrix telling me what is the cost of assigning this agent to this resource, right? Then in this case, right, what this is basically telling me is that for agent 2, there's a 0 cost of assigning that agent to any of the resources, except there's a 1 minus epsilon cost of assigning it to resource n minus 1, and a cost of 1 of assigning it to resource n. So if we look at this and we have to do a one-to-one assignment of agents to different resources, we can see that Leximin would actually end up being pretty bad, right? Because Leximin would assign this agent to the 1 minus epsilon resource, and then given that it would have to assign this agent to this 1 minus epsilon resource. And so we'd end up assigning every agent to a resource that has cost 1 minus epsilon to that agent, right? So this ends up being sort of, you know, a very poor utility outcome that we get from doing this. So the price of fairness in that case, right, essentially goes to n as we get a large number of agents, because this is sort of an example of that kind of worst case, because obviously we could do something that was much better by choosing to assign, you know, this agent to the resource that has a cost of 1 for that agent, but then I could assign all of the others to resources that have a cost of 0. So this is sometimes referred to as sort of the bottomless pit problem with Leximin fairness. So I want to actually think about this, and I want to think about models of fairness in kind of a static version of our problem. So what we looked at was a dynamic version of the problem where I was doing reallocations every week, but just to kind of simplify our lives, what I want to do is I want to look at a static version where I'm going to take, you know, let's say all 14,000 of these agents at one time and just be able to do the reallocation across all time instead of doing it on a weekly basis, right? Otherwise, the IP looks the same as it did last time when I presented it, right? It's just this time we're aggregating over all time. So we're not going to take any dynamic considerations into account. All right. So there's sort of the two ideas that we've been thinking about over here. So first of these is that actually, if you look at the literature on what's called local justice, you can talk about utilitarian welfare, and that's a fairly common one. You can talk about Rawlsian, realized as Leximin in this case. That's also a fairly common one. There's a third one, however, that hasn't gotten much attention in the CS or algorithmic fairness literature, at least that I'm aware of so far, which is a principle of justice that is often used in triage situations. So the classic example of this is like battlefield medicine or something like that. These days, you know, unfortunately, we're having to actually rediscover some of this in terms of allocation of scarce resources to COVID patients, right? So we've been thinking about this as a society in terms of, you know, who gets very scarce ICU ventilator kinds of beds versus who gets just to go to the hospital versus who has to stay at home and those kinds of things. So in these kinds of situations, a principle that is often used is sort of the classic triage principle, which is to say, the person I will prioritize for services is the person who is likely to benefit the most from these services. So instead of looking at sort of absolute cost or absolute utility, you look at what is the marginal utility to this person of receiving the resource. And so we formalize this idea into a fairness or justice principle that we call Leximin over individually normalized costs, or LOINC, which you can also just think of as the sum of the regrets over all of the agents if you're used to sort of the regret literature from machine learning. So in this case, what we're going to do is for each agent, we're going to just subtract off sort of, you know, what is the best that they could have done so that I get some sense of, or what is the worst that they could have done so that I get some sense of what is the marginal improvement of giving each of these resources to each of these agents. And so in this case, if I look at that worst case example I was just showing you, it looks a lot better now, because if I look at agent N, the marginal benefit of giving agent N any of these other resources over the first resource is only epsilon. And so the matrix that I'm now doing Leximin over looks very different from the matrix that I'm doing Leximin over here, because I'm subtracting off sort of what is the best case over here For all of the others, right, the lowest cost is 0. So all of these rows stay the same. We're just changing the last row over here because really for the last agent, there's not much benefit from going from any of these resources back to this one. But now that makes it much more reasonable. If I do lexamin over this, right, I can assign this agent epsilon, and then I can assign all of the others 0 cost. And I end up with something that is much closer to the efficient allocation in this case. Now, this isn't always going to be the case. I'm just showing you an illustration of where it looks different. The nice thing about this is that I'm going to also add in sort of one other assumption that will allow us to prove some results, which is that in many of these settings, right, if I have different interventions, very much the opposite of the heterogeneous thing that I just talked about, right? There could be a certain homogeneity to the effectiveness of these interventions. And that means that for an individual, I might be able to make the assumption that, in fact, that matrix that I just showed you of the ordering is constant. That is, for every single person, intervention 1 is better than intervention 2, is better than intervention 3, is better than intervention 4. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the same for all of them, right? They could all have different levels, but the basic idea is, everybody's survival probability is, no, this isn't exactly true, but it's an approximation. Everybody's survival probability is increased by having a hospital bed over home care, and then it's further increased by having an ICU bed over having a hospital bed. In the same way, you could think that at least among some of the interventions in the homelessness setting, their probability of a successful exit is better when they have transitional housing as opposed to rapid rehousing, as opposed to emergency shelter. And so if you make that assumption, then we can assume that each row of this allocation matrix is sorted, and it's sorted in the same order. The nice thing about this, I know I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'll just sort of present you briefly with some of the results, is that we can actually show some nice bounds on the price of fairness when we have, so let's say we have K equal capacity interventions. We can show bounds on both lexamin and loink that are kind of dependent on K, but that actually look substantially better for loink than they do for the lexamin allocations. And so kind of the form of it is a little bit complicated, but it can actually be worked out for specific utility distributions. And what these pictures are basically showing you is, suppose my utilities or costs are coming from, costs in this case are coming from either a uniform 0-1 distribution, beta 0.5 distribution, or a distribution that's actually estimated off of our homelessness reentry probabilities data set. What we've got over here is, on the top, we've got the empirical prices of fairness for the lexamin allocation versus the loink allocation. So the lexamin's in blue and the loink is in orange. And we can see that, loink is obviously doing much better in terms of price of fairness, in terms of the realized version. And what we've got at the bottom is that we're plotting the actual theoretical bounds computed using these distributions that are in place over here. And again, you can see that both the bounds are better and the realized values of price of fairness are significantly better in these kinds of situations that are operationalizing this other notion of justice, which is this triage principle of give the resource to the person who would benefit the most from receiving that resource. If we actually do this on our homelessness data set, it's pretty interesting. As we said, right, it doesn't actually satisfy this row sortedness criterion that I talked about, but it's not entirely heterogeneous either. The efficient allocation, as we can see, has a total cost of 3,682. The price of fairness over there is obviously 1 because it's the efficient allocation. The largest cost that we see is 0.93. If you compare that to lexamin, right, lexamin goes up to 3,774, which again, the price of fairness, it's not huge, right? Actually, it's much less than the bounds would make you think. It's 1.025. But you can see that the largest cost being paid by anybody is 0.897. If you go to the loink version, then we get much, much closer again to the efficient allocation. Actually, we're very, very close to the efficient allocation in this case. And again, the reason for that is probably that this 0.93 is a case where you don't probably get a lot of benefit by switching them to another intervention. So even though that 0.93 benefit, that 0.93 cost seems high, you're not going to do that much better by switching them to anything else. And so basically by taking an idea from sort of the theory of a real world sort of principle by which people do sort of local allocation of resources and making an assumption about the way in which things are structured, we're able to both prove kind of tighter bounds and kind of analyze this other notion of justice in terms of what kinds of costs it might lead to in the world. So finally, I had sort of one slide on this, which I'll kind of rush through, but a completely different problem that I think is also really, really interesting that we've been looking at is this problem of trying to say, okay, so suppose you need to make these sort of machine learning predictions of how well will somebody do in a particular intervention. You often do this on the basis not just of attributes that you know for sure, but it could also be that you're interviewing people and they're self-reporting some of these attributes. So you may know for sure, what is their age and how many family members do they have, but they may be self-reporting their disability status or their monthly income or their substance abuse history and so on and so forth. And they could do that in a way to try to explicitly try to get resources for themselves, right? The idea that we're exploring over here is, could we selectively audit some set of recipients of the resources? And if they are found to be lying, then sort of, say, okay, you're not eligible for this resource because you lied to me in your intake interview. And can we sort of create incentive compatible ways in which they would actually truthfully report what they're doing? There's a nice theoretical result that we have, which is that if you're making decisions just based on a score threshold, then the optimal audit policy has this very nice uniform structure where you audit uniformly at random any agent who might possibly gain from lying in the final set. But on the other hand, if you're in a scarce resource setting where only the top K of the agents can receive the resources, the problem actually becomes much harder. It's much more challenging in every respect. And the audit policy doesn't have this sort of equally nice uniform auditing structure that we talked about over there. So that's another sort of interesting new direction in thinking about, what are all of the problems that arise when you're trying to do this allocation of scarce resources over populations of agents that you're interacting with. So finally, I just want to say, we're working on a bunch of different directions over here. I've already told you about, some of the things that we're excited about. In the big picture, I really am excited about, in the coming years, exploring further how we can use data, machine learning, AI in the service of efficiency, equity, and justice in society, both in sort of these kinds of resource allocation and other domains. I'm really hoping that even, my goal is not necessarily to deploy these systems, although in some cases that may be possible, but to do research that can successfully inform policy and perhaps give us decision aids and tools that we can use in the future for doing this kind of resource allocation. So I want to thank you for your time, and I also want to thank all the amazing people who have done and helped and contributed to all of this work. In particular, Amanda Kuby and Patrick Fowler, who have really been sort of the driving forces behind our work on homelessness in general, and my CS colleagues and students, Kwan, Andrew, Eugene, and Roman. This has largely been funded by various NSF awards and also some funding from the WashU Institute for Public Health. Very grateful that we've had the opportunity to do all of this work and that I've had the chance to tell you all about it. So thanks for your time.
Thank you, Sanmay, for the wonderful talk. Are there any questions? Anybody?
So I see one on the chat from Shantanu.
Right, yeah.
It says, okay, why not use causal forest to estimate counterfactual? Actually, that was interestingly our first idea. One thing about causal forests, at least at the time when we were looking at using them 2 or 3 years ago, is that they can be pretty useful, but they don't actually give you a nice sort of probabilistic structure of your estimates, right? They can give you kind of confidence bounds on whether you're getting an effect or not getting an effect. I didn't find an easy way. We also actually, frankly, we had a lot of struggles with trying to get the causal forest software to work and to and there are different versions of it that were giving us different answers across all domains. That may be a problem that has been fixed, but more naturally, I think BART does a better job of sort of providing me with a posterior over possibilities of outcomes, and I want to potentially be able to use that posterior information because I may actually want to be making decisions at the end of the day about should I allocate somebody to a particular resource, not just based on the expected outcome from allocating them to that resource, but also perhaps based on the entire distribution. In fact, one thing we're thinking about is can we use confidence intervals on the counterfactuals as a way of sort of constraining what we're going to be able to do. So yeah, so that also partly answers your second question, which is we're thinking about how to do that. And in fact, it's something that that we're very eager to explore, because there's this question of like, how confident are we in the counterfactuals that I'd love to think more about, but we haven't done a huge amount on that front yet, but it's coming up.
Right. Great. Are there any other questions? Okay.
So in this case, in particular, in our real data sets, I'm not sure if tie breaking would have a huge effect, because each of these estimates is actually very fine-grained and quite different from each other. So I don't, I think that actually like we're close to having probability 0 of actually having any ties in our data set because of BART. Actually, with other machine learning algorithms, if you build up these matrices, you will see probabilities that look the same across two people. With BART, actually, that very rarely happens. I mean, I think that the LOINC's performance is probably just because the objectives are kind of better aligned in general anyhow, right? You've got this additive structure to the LOINC thing that is kind of minimizing regret summed across everyone, that if you think of the silly case where everyone has the same baseline, then actually LOINC is exactly the same as efficiency. Or if you have only 2 resources, then again LOINC is exactly the same as efficiency. I think as K gets higher, it's possible that the difference between the LOINC allocation and the efficient allocation, if you've got a sufficient diversity of preferences, will probably increase as the number of resources increases. I didn't think about the arbitrary tie-breaking issue with Leximin. I should definitely think about that a little bit more. I don't think it comes up much in our data set, as I said, but I think that would probably be an issue anytime that you've got things that could actually be tied. It's a really good question.
I was thank you, Sanmay. I was just thinking about the very kind of canonical example that you showed.
Mm-hmm.
That Leximin has with the tie breaking, because really making decision there. And I thought maybe there is a connection, that the reason that you're getting better performance, but I completely forgot about the fact that you're using in a real data, and tie breaking is very unlikely to happen.
Right. So for the bounds, I think that's quite possible that yes, that the bounds look really bad because of the ties. But yeah, so that's actually a really sort of interesting point, right? Because if you actually look at this picture in a little more detail, wait, where did the picture go? I went way too far back. The numbers on the y-axis are like completely different from each other, right? And I think that's so if you look at this, these are the empirical prices of fairness up here, and you can see that the range is going from 1 to 1.06. The bounds are like way up here, right? They're going up to like 15. And I think that because you could construct pretty bad things for Leximin with the ties. I think you're exactly right over there. It's yeah, I think that might have a significant effect on the bounds. I hadn't thought much about that because I was thinking about the real data. That's a great point.
Thank you.
Sanmay, I had one question. If nobody else has any other questions. Anybody? Okay, so my question is regarding you mentioned that the way you're solving that, with your interventions, the way you're doing it is you're resolving the optimization problem every week, batching all the requests that come in every week, and you're resolving. So I wonder if there's any benefits to optimizing over the long run. And I understand that for that you would need to have some model for arrivals of what are the request rates. But if you think about I'm imagining that the number of homeless households is a finite number. There's some arrival rate that new households become homeless at a certain rate. But if you have a fixed number of households, there's sort of like, as you are processing them, they fall out of homelessness. So I wonder if there's
That's a great question, and it also happens to be something we're pretty actively working on, or at least we were. So that's actually sort of, so my colleague CJ Ho and I have been looking at this question of fully online matching of agents to resources with a model of future arrivals, basically. So not even to do the weekly thing, but basically to say every time an agent arrives, you have some set of available resources. Which resource should you match that agent to, or should you keep them out? And then you assume that they have some amount of time that they're willing to wait once they arrive.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to think about sort of how we would do that optimally, with the idea that at the moment we're kind of simplifying. So this is sort of more theoretical work, right? But it's basically saying, okay, suppose you assign this agent to this resource. There's a certain amount of time that you get to stay in that resource, and then that resource becomes reusable again.
I see.
So it's actually, it turns out to have relations to a lot of this sort of optimal scheduling literature in the OS community and other kinds of stuff over time. So we've been like learning a little bit more about that, but we've been trying to use both sort of some of these primal dual techniques to try to solve the online matching problem, and also trying to come up with MDP type formulations to try to solve that problem. It's definitely, I mean, it is absolutely, your intuition is 100% spot on there, right? That it's the right problem to solve. We are solving, kind of a more convenient problem that is easier to deal with in terms of the data. But actually, what happens is people call, actually, it's really bad in practice, because people call and now they're trying to build a little bit more of a wait list, but there didn't even used to be a wait list. It used to be that, like, you call, if there's a resource available, you can get that resource. Otherwise, you just have to call back again. And that's why, like, people who are more persistent in calling may be more likely to actually receive a resource, because they have to time their call to a point in time when a resource happens to be available. And so it has truly been an online problem, right? It's like you could really only match people at the moment of arrival if a resource is available, like, but they're trying to do a better job. I know LA does a somewhat better job of like maintaining a waiting list, and potentially trying to actually find people on that waiting list and get them into the resources. St. Louis did not used to do a particularly good job of that. They've been trying to do a better job of that recently. I'm not sure exactly where it stands. Last time I was in a meeting with them, there was just general frustration about everything. So, and they keep changing the IT system they're using like every year.
I see.
There's lots of sort of real world problems with that, but yeah, that's where things are.
And the work that you've done, this is with one particular city. I don't know if there's some organization that manages these departments. I mean, I'm just talking about, I mean, since you've already done this work and you've tested it in one city, I mean, is there hope to bootstrap it to other cities as well? I don't know.
It's a good question, right? So we've been talking to various people through Patrick. Each city, I mean, a lot of it comes down to what is your IT infrastructure actually, and how do you handle these kinds of things. So in many places, it's like the United Way kind of handles the calls that are coming in to the system, and then, like, there's this question of, can you hook up with the United Way to like get access to that sort of call hotline. But actually, many cities don't even maintain a call hotline. So it's even building up the relationship with sort of one city and trying to get that done involves navigating a lot of egos and different incentives of people. So I'm not sure. It might be kind of difficult, and it's very hard to get data, I know. So.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Sanmay.